cutting your teeth part of like being out there doing gigs. And like, it's so important to have that experience, get out of your bedroom and like play some shows. And that means different things to different people. But, and I know the opportunities aren't the same as what they were, but to me, that's like still such an important part of developing as a musician into whatever it may be. If you want to be an engineer or a producer or a musician or a teacher or whatever, you know, I still think that that's kind of a key element that I think people are aware of the importance of it, but it seems to get downplayed a little bit. And I guess that's what I would say is like still the most important thing is like spending that time ideally in a situation where there's some performance involved. And it's not just about like the audience or the crowd. It's like about learning how to communicate and, you know, work out arrangements with people and figure out how music works. There's no other way of doing it than just diving in there. And
welcome to the Vocal Lab. I'm Sarah Ramsey, and this show aims to pull back the curtain on the entertainment industry, where veterans give up-and-coming artists some of the information they wish they'd had when they were just starting out. Sort of a music industry primer, if you will. Thanks for joining us on the Vocal Lab. This is actually part 2 of our interview. So if you haven't caught part 1 yet, head back to the episode right before this one and get all caught up, and then join us back here. We'll see you soon. From the perspective of being a player, you write original music, but also, and maybe especially because of the genres of music that you explore as an artist, being more sort of roots Americana based, it's perhaps a little bit more standard to also work with other people's tunes as well. And you can correct me if I have any of that wrong. But my question is, do you want to talk a little bit about the process of taking someone else's material and making it your own, sort of telling your own story with it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that is, I don't think you're wrong in saying that. I don't think it's like a set thing that people have to do, but it's certainly something that is acceptable in the genre. And, you know, whether it's, you know, people covering a John Prine song because he writes such great songs, or if it's, or the main thing, I guess, is like, there's this whole, the thing for me is like, there's this whole world of traditional music that exists that is sort of like out there in the public domain. And it's so great that it's worth tapping into. Certainly not everybody does it, but I do it. And so, yeah, the process for that, like basically, I don't know. I don't really ever think about it. It's just that I know I've collected it and I have a lot of material that is like, you know, from the 1920s, 1930s, and I like it. And I've never been interested in playing it exactly the same or anything. I always want to do some sort of interpretation of it. So, you know, a lot of that stuff has been approached before. Like, for example, on my newest record, we do a version of a song called House Carpenter. And it's one of those songs that, like, even in the 30s, there was probably like 20 versions of it. And nobody knows where it came from because it's just sort of become this thing of what it is. But like, if you hear Son House's version of it, and then you hear Mississippi John Hurt do it, they sing, it's kind of the same song, but they have all different lyrics. And it's like, well, where did that, he learned it from somewhere in Mississippi and he learned it from somewhere in Georgia. So there's a different set of lyrics. So it's like very, very open to interpretation, which is nice. It's like a blank slate. And so, yeah, I mean, if I'm going to approach a tune like that, I always want to find something instrumentally that is interesting to me. So for me to come up with that, there was like, I was experimenting with a guitar tuning that I wasn't familiar with. And I played it on the Weisenborn, which you were asking about. And that's like a lap steel, like an acoustic lap steel with a hollow neck. So I kind of developed like a guitar riff idea kind of thing that's sort of like reminded me of that. And then it was sort of a matter of adapting the melody to suit what I was doing. And so, yeah, I mean, but I've also played that same song with a guy named Kelly Joe Phelps, and I've also played that song with another person. So, and they did it completely differently from each other as well. So, yeah, it's mostly just finding a version that's worth bothering to do because it has been done before. You know, there's some great versions, there's some not so great versions. You have to kind of feel like your version is worth doing. And I mean, that's really all it is. It's like, it's just another tune. It's just that canon of American roots music is really deep. And, you know, it's kind of weird to, in a way, to pick a song that's been done 100 times, like that song, when there's like thousands of songs that have never been done. But I don't know. There's just something about the mythology in that song in particular that draws people in. And there's a reason for that is pretty deep. And when you hear the song, it's like, oh yeah, like that. It makes sense why that song has been picked up on more than another one, you know? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of easy to lump a lot of that music together and just say like, oh, it's got 3 chords and it's sort of a blues thing or whatever. But when you start really studying that music, you realize, you know, the level of the musicianship that was going on, the innovation in the technique. There was, you know, there's stuff that people were playing in the 30s that nobody's come close to playing technically since. I don't mean that across the board, but for the most part, a lot of that stuff is pretty phenomenal. And if you're a guitar player and you pick up an old record by, say, Son House or by Skip James or by Blind Blake, and you work on it and try and figure it out, like I have, you realize that you can spend your entire life trying to play half as good as those guys did. And it's just really deep and it's fun to get into. And for me, it's fun to get into that stuff and learn it and then kind of like let it filter through you and then never do it again, because I don't want to be like that. And I'm certainly not like that in my life. And so why would I try and copy that? But I find it very engaging music and I want to pick up what I can from people that are doing stuff that sounds so great. So I learn what I can.
I think when we are drawing on those that have come before us, that perspective of doing a deep dive and then letting it filter through and letting it sort of influence your playing without becoming that player, or influence your singing without becoming that singer, that kind of thing. I think that's the value of all the historical music that has come before, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And, you know, whether you're talking about jazz or folk music or whatever it is, there's a huge history there of recorded music and things that came before recorded music. But if we're talking about the advent of recording, it's from basically the 1920s on. And so if you limit it to that, there's a finite amount of music, but it's pretty massive and it's a great well of information if you're interested in that kind of thing, you know.
So you recently came back from being up here in BC for a couple of weeks on a short tour, right? You want to talk about the realities of life on tour and the impact that sort of has on body and voice. Touring is not always as pretty as perhaps it seems from afar. And there can be some harsh realities for singers around vocal fatigue and lifestyle and all that.
So that's something I've had some experience with, and then worked with people who are like far better singers than I am, like Alison Russell, who I toured with, and she had that happen where and actually her partner, JT, who was the other half of Birds of Chicago, he had sort of vocal nodes that he had to get operated on that it was really hard, you know, problematic. She had this thing happen where her voice just gave out and she had all these huge shows to do and she had to pull out of them. And then working with somebody like Matt Anderson who has one of the most massive voices I've ever come across in my life. And he just seems to like have a bottomless amount of stamina for it. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know where that difference is, but he can sing louder and harder than anyone I know night after night. And there's like not a problem. It just doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if his technique is so good. You would know a lot more than I would about that. But I kind of think that it's not. I kind of think he doesn't have great technique. He's just sort of like blessed with this voice that can do crazy stuff that other people's voices can't, and he can do it forever. And maybe that'll stop one day, but it seems to be working just fine for him. Allison didn't have, I think she had some flawed technique probably that caught up with her. I think that's sort of what happened in her case. Mm-hmm. Not that there's anything flawed about the way that it comes across, but like obviously there's ways to sing properly, and I think she was probably overdoing it and touring a ton. So yeah, I mean, for me, touring these days is not like what it used to be. And when I was touring a lot, I wasn't really singing. I was singing some backup harmonies and stuff. So there wasn't, mm-hmm. And if I blew my voice out, nobody was going to be like super bummed because that wasn't really my mm-hmm. gig, So I never had that issue with being a side person where what I had to contribute vocally was so important that it would be a huge problem if I blew my voice out. Mm-hmm. So the stamina thing for me is like, it was never really an issue. I never had any physical issues with my hand. I guess I have had some sort of hand wrist things, but nothing like super debilitating, knock on wood, I guess. Mm-hmm. I certainly could have. And like hauling gear around is something that, if you don't have a crew of people lifting stuff for you, like when I was in Matt's band, we kind of did have we kind of had a crew that would load in all our stuff and carry a bunch of mm-hmm. the heavy things. And so I wasn't having to haul my pedal steel around, which weighs, 60 pounds or whatever.
Oh, geez.
But when I toured with Birds of Chicago, I was carrying all my stuff and setting up all my stuff. And, mm-hmm. Yeah, you could easily run into problems with your back, your wrist, and you have to be aware of that. I was sort of blissfully ignorant, I guess, for the most part. I don't know. Like I never really focused too much on health other than staying healthy, like in general, I'd go for runs and I'd exercise and things like that. That especially as I aged, it's like, you have to kind of stay on top of that, especially if you're on the road, because the food can be shitty. And sometimes mm-hmm. you have to go to bed at 2 a.m. and get up at 5 a.m. and things like that can definitely make you unhealthy.
Yep.
But I don't know. I never really had any serious problems. When I was up in Vancouver, like you mentioned, that's my band, and I'm singing and mm-hmm. playing. And I'm a guitar player, and I don't pretend to be the world's greatest vocalist or anything like that, or even in the top 20,000. But singing is part of what I do in my show, and I feel I feel fine about where my skills as a vocalist are, and it gets me where I need to go. But it's really like my guitar playing is the important thing for me. And I do have sort of like, I would say, I don't think it's a physical issue. I think it's a mental block of some sort that manifests itself. And it's like totally a post-COVID thing. This never used to happen to me, but post-COVID, there's mm-hmm. some sort of trauma or whatever that now when I go on tour, I have this added element of like stress that manifests itself in my throat. And mm-hmm. and it almost every time now happens. Like if I'm here at home, like I am now, I'm totally fine. And I was concerned enough about it to go and see an ENT, ear, nose, throat doctor, and he stuck a camera down my throat and he's like, "You're fine."
Which is the right call, by the way.
I think
if something is happening on repeat, that is absolutely the right call.
I did go to see him like I was not close on either side to touring. So like maybe I had done some damage and it was kind of sorted itself out. But he basically said, you're fine physically. But still, like, 3 weeks later, I went on tour and like without fail, 2 or 3 days before the tour, my throat starts hurting. It gets dry. And then I start worrying, like, am I going to lose my voice? Which like isn't maybe the end of the world musically. I could still do a show instrumentally and feel good about it, but like it would be a problem. I've got a band, we've got songs to play. Yeah. And one time I lost my voice, and it was at we were doing a session in Vancouver, not this time, but like a year ago. And I'd been rehearsing and doing another project and doing another session. And then I came into my session and I'd blown my voice out. And that's not totally surprising because the amount of stuff going on with like lack of sleep and like organizing things and talking through a rehearsal and like doing all that stuff.
Yeah.
But almost exclusively all these problems that come up in my throat that I consider important and stressful to me, it never actually transpires into anything. It's the cause of a great deal of stress. And I can't figure out how to fix it. So that's what I battle with now, is like this sort of, I wouldn't say it's crippling, but it's like, it's a problem for me and I don't know what the answer is. And I don't know, maybe there is an answer. Maybe there's not. Maybe I just have to battle through it. I'm not really sure. But technically, physically, I think there's nothing wrong with me. I think it's all just some sort of emotional roller coaster going on in my head that spirals out of control. And usually it ends up okay.
We could go deep into that, but we probably don't have enough time today in the podcast to do that. But it would be interesting to, to do that work. What I see is in my work as a vocal coach is that the stuff that shows up in our voice is usually paralleled in our lives for starters. Yeah. So, and vice versa. So if there's concerns around stuff to do with touring that, maybe are as a result of COVID and some trauma that we've, experienced through that and fears that now come up around travel and being around people and, whatever, those things can absolutely show up in our voices. And also our voices are like, our throat is I don't know if you get into this stuff, but if you look at chakras, like it's everything filters through, and then it's this like little tiny, everything's funneling through, but it's this little tiny gateway in your throat, and it all, there can be a huge squeeze there. And I have seen that very much manifest, not to get too woo woo, but I have definitely seen that manifest as just a lot of tension in there that can show up as soreness, vocal fatigue, all sorts of things. Sure. And those things can come at in a number of different ways, even if it's nothing structurally that you would see with a camera down your throat that is like, quote unquote, wrong with your voice. And you said something earlier around vocal technique when you were talking about the other singers. And I would just mention that the voice science has come to a place where we talk a lot less about like good technique and bad technique, and we talk a lot more about sustainable technique, right? Like there's kind of, when you take the long view of it, there's not so much a thing about good technique and bad technique. What it is what you are doing, is that a thing that is sustainable? Right. And that is where you can get in trouble. And also there's a piece of genetics that sometimes is just a bit inexplicable.
Yeah. Like with Matt Anderson, when I look at him, I'm like, there is no way that's sustainable. It's like a thunderingly powerful voice. And it's just like, it's phenomenal. But you look at him I look over at him on stage and I'm like, there's no way he's going to be able to talk after the show. going so hard. And then he's totally fine. It's just like, yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
And then the next day is no problem.
Well, I mean, you look historically at the folks who can drink a fifth of Jack and smoke 3 packs a day and have no problems and still be singing their hearts out in their 80s. And then you have people who have really delicate voices and they're doing all the right things and all the right care. And they have voices that are delicate and have problems a lot more easily throughout their lives, even though they're doing all the quote unquote right things. So there has to be a piece of genetics, but that's the piece that's uncontrollable. What we do with it is the piece that's controllable.
Totally. Yeah.
You have your own podcast, Music Makers and Soul Shakers.
I do.
You want to talk about what inspired you to start that and talk a bit about your show?
Yeah. So it's been going for 6 seasons now. I'm about to start the 7th. And it was kind of brought on because I'm a bit of a podcast junkie. Like I listen to them a fair amount, when I'm driving or when I'm out for a run or thing. That's what I listen to more than music. Like I don't really like listening to music in the car. So I end up listening. Podcasts for me is what fills a lot of that space. And some of the shows that I really liked would bring musicians on, and then they would never talk about the things that I thought they should talk about, or they just didn't go very deep, or it was like, hey, so like just sort of surfacey questions about road stories or something, but it never really got into the meat of, making records and like talking about stuff that I wanted to hear about. And so I just decided to do it myself. And so it started, in 2016, I started it. And it was meant sort of like what yours is, like long form conversational, but that we would really delve into the process of making records for not only that, but like that's sort of the heavily favored topic of conversation, I guess, but without getting technical. I didn't want to get bogged down in like what kind of microphone do you use and what kind of strings do you like. I didn't want to talk about gear. So I basically never talk about gear. It's all like approaches and like, just different than equipment, because I think there's more to it than that. And so it sort of started like Bill Frisell was the first person I had on, and I had a season of 20 shows or something like that and just launched them. And I figured I would do it and just sort of see what happens. And then it was successful enough. Like, I don't mean financially successful, because podcasting does not exactly change your life financially, but
I'm well aware.
But it was sustainable to like, it's basically like a hobby, I guess, is how I consider it, but it's sort of a time suck of a hobby. Cause I do put a lot of effort into it, and it takes a lot of time, and, setting people up, and then like something happens and you have to change the schedule. Like, it's time consuming. And so
you're preaching to the choir.
But I've figured out a way to kind of coexist with it, and I feel like it's worth it. It's opened up doors to me to work with people from unusual places, and there's just been a lot of paths that I can trace back to the podcast and people that I've met around the world from doing it. And so for me, it is worth the hassle of what it all means. And I really enjoy the conversational part. It's just all the other bullshit that like of setting it up, and like, I try and get sponsors. So I'm sort of chasing down people to give me money basically to do it. And that can be a real grind. But I try and do that once a year, and then listeners support me with Patreon and things like that. So I have little streams of income that sort of make, and there's, as you know, too, there's like hard costs involved and things like that. So I can get all that stuff covered, and, it's just like a reliable thing that I can do. And I try and get all the interviews done usually in like January and February. So I'm not doing it all through the year. So I bank them all up and then start a new season. So I've got a new season coming up. It starts in a couple weeks, and I've done most of the interviews for the whole season already. So there's going to be 20 new episodes, but I drop them every 2 weeks, basically. So once they start in June, they'll come out every 2 weeks. And so they'll carry over until January or something like that. And then, I don't know. I never know if I'm going to do it again, but as long as they're, originally my concept was to talk to people that had been doing it for like 50 years. So it was like, I wasn't talking to anyone that was under like 60. And that to me was the most interesting. And then I started talking to younger people as well, and people my own age. And that was also interesting in different ways. It's way different talking to somebody who's only made 3 records than it is talking to a guy that's played on 800 records. So that to me is also really interesting, just finding out interesting things about people. So yeah, like a lot of it is a bit of a grind, like trying to find the guests. Most people that I have on the show, it's mostly people that I've either worked with or have some direct connection to, because I don't know, going through managers and agents and stuff can be really soul sucking, because a lot of them just don't respond, or they say, oh, that would be really cool, let's do that, and then you never hear from them again. Like that kind of thing happens enough where it's like, if I don't have to deal with a manager or a publicist, I'm gonna not do that. So I end up like talking to artists directly, and that's mostly through like my work as a musician or producer. Either I've worked with somebody or I know somebody that's worked with somebody. So almost, that's not always the case, but like 70% of it is done that way, where I'm not doing it from a publicity point of view. And I also try
it's not a complete cold call.
And I also try and not make it about like their new record. But now that the podcast has been out for 6 years, I get hit up by publicists all the time, but it's not necessarily somebody that I'm super aware of or interested in, or like, if it's, but what their angle always is like, this guy has a new single, or this woman has a new album, or whatever it is. But that's not really what I want to talk to them about. Like, I don't really care that they have a new single out. I want to talk about something they did 15 years ago, maybe, or whatever. So I just sort of avoid those situations as much as I can, and just talk to people that's another good way to kind of connect with people too, is like when they're not in the cycle of promoting a new record and they have time, and you can, because when people are promoting a record, they get into these ruts of talking about the same thing over and over again, and even like developing a storyline that may or may not be super accurate. That to me is not very interesting. So when you catch somebody kind of off guard or not in the record promotion mode, they can be way more engaged in the process. So that's what I try and tap into, I guess. And so I've done 140 episodes or something, and this will be another 20, and we'll see what happens after that.
Nice. Yeah. And you utilize Patreon to support your podcast. And I'm a bit surprised to say it, but I believe that you are the first guest I've had on the show who makes use of anything along those lines. Like, I mean, there's different versions. Patreon is one of them, but there's different versions of that same concept. I think it's an incredibly smart way to sort of build your brand and community at the same time. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience of using a platform like that, and at what point it made sense to incorporate it?
Well, it makes sense right away, really, I think, because you have nothing to lose. There's no cost to it.
Okay.
So, what you're looking for is people that, I think the idea where Patreon works for something like this, like for a podcast, is if you get a large number of people kicking in a couple bucks a month instead of 5 people kicking in $100 a month, So if you can convince people that listen to your show, and, part of that is like regular, I have this 2-week interval, and people get used to that, and they expect, they expect there to be a new show every 2 weeks, and then it comes out and they're like engaged in that because that's what's happening. And that, along with that builds like, a fan of your show. And if somebody's a fan of the show, they might be inclined to support it. And if that means $3 a month, so be it. That's, it's more than $0 a month. And so the idea with Patreon is that you get enough of these people supporting your show and your endeavors in that regard, and you can have a somewhat reliable, steady stream of income. It's just another stream of income, basically. And like for me, it fluctuates wildly. It's pretty solid all through the season. And then when I stop doing it, like my season ended in March, I guess. And so I haven't done it for April or May, and I'll go half of June. So that's like 2.5 months where I don't do it. And people just totally like bail on you at that point, which is understandable. But I try and talk about it, and I'm like, hey, this is actually when I'm doing the most work, and I could still use the dough. So if $5 a month isn't really like breaking your bank, I would encourage you to keep forking it over, because it helps me out, and I got expenses and I'm doing all this work. So whatever, like there's no requirement to use it. And people generally assume that podcasting is a free endeavor, and it is for the most part. But I think people need to
it is and it isn't.
People need to step up for things like that these days. And it's not that much money to kick in a few bucks a month. And that's the price of a free market like this. Like podcasting is, it's going to change at some point, and it may stop being free. I don't know how it's going to play out, but maybe it won't. But yeah, we need to have some sort of support, or it becomes like I wouldn't do it if I didn't have some money coming in for it. I wouldn't be able to. It just wouldn't make any sense. I would be losing money doing it, and I don't want to do that. So
being my first season this year, I've definitely just been losing money. Straight up. Well, losing money. But I've been doing it as a passion project and working towards starting to figure out how to, monetize it down the road.
Yeah, I probably went 2 or 3 years without even thinking about that. And then I was like, actually, I got to sort this out, because like at the time I was spending tons of time editing, and I don't do that anymore really. But it was really time consuming, and I was generating no money doing it. So it was purely like a hobby. So now it's like now I think of it as like a hobby that sort of pays for itself, I guess.
Yeah. If it breaks even, that's all right. I actually, partway into this season, because I started out editing everything myself, and I can do the physical editing, but any of the like plugins kind of stuff to make it sound better, I'm at sea. I don't know what I'm doing. And partway through this season, I hired an editor, Kurt Mass, who that has been a godsend to me, to be able to send it out, and he edits it, and it comes back, and I upload it, and I don't have to deal with that part of it, because that hands down was the biggest time suck of the whole endeavor.
Yeah, that takes a huge amount of time, especially when you're doing long form stuff like this, where it's not just like a 5-minute song. It's like an hour and a half or whatever it is. And you have to deal with all that audio. So you need to have somebody. Well, I say that, but I do it all myself still. I had a guy a couple of years ago, but for now, I just do it myself. Cause I also I'm only doing 20 episodes. It's not like Mark Maron or something where he's doing 2 shows a week.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's a lot. So you need somebody that's got your back to look after some of that stuff.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like,
I do one interview that gets split into 2 episodes, but go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, like, once every 2 weeks, I put aside an afternoon and I can knock one out, in an afternoon. And so that's what I try and do. But I guess in a perfect world, I would not have to do that.
Yeah, I feel you on that. And I was recently talking to someone about you, and I can't remember who this was actually, but and they commented on the fact that you've really built a community through your music, your podcast, everything that you do. Do you want to talk about that aspect of building a community?
If it's there, I'm not hyper aware of it, but I mean, I have developed a crew of people that I use and I guess gainfully employ when I can to do work with me, and that feels like a community. I'm talking about recording. And with gigs, obviously, I have a crew of people that I use for that. Some of them overlap and some of them don't. And I feel like that's sort of its own little micro community. With the podcast, like during the pandemic, I was really trying to get people to engage in the show, and that worked to a certain extent. I was, I opened up, I didn't have like live callers, but I had a phone that would take messages and people would call in, and we would just kind of like debrief about where things were at with music and all that stuff. And that worked during the pandemic, but I don't do that anymore because it's just kind of, so the crazy thing for me though, is like when I look at my stats, which for podcasting, they're getting a little bit better. They used to be just so vague. You couldn't really tell what was going on, but now it's to the point where you can sort of get a feel for like what's happening out there with your show. And that to me always like really blows my mind. Like, there's like 400 people from Sweden listen to my show. It's like, it blows my mind. And yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't really try and engage with people as much as maybe I could or I should. So I don't hear from that many people all that often, but I do enough for me to be aware that it's, some people really enjoy the show and they like to listen to it and they like to expect to hear it. And so that's cool. And yeah, definitely like all over the world, it's definitely strongest in the United States, followed by Canada, followed by Ireland, followed by the UK, followed by Sweden. And then from there, it's like, small, but the Sweden or Australia is in there too, but they're all substantial amount of listeners. And so, yeah, I've just switched my podcast over to a new host, and I'm curious to see, like, they have a different way of reporting what's happening with your show. So I'm interested to see how that changes what I'm actually seeing, because it was mostly because Apple and Spotify held it really close. They just didn't want to share the information.
I know. They just don't.
And they still don't, but you can sort of get an idea now, like with, at least geographically what's happening, sort of the demographics, but I don't really believe that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's interesting, and it's great to see. Like, what you can do is find out how many times your show has been downloaded. And that's the ultimately the number that people are going to see and care about if you're, wanting to get advertisers or something like that. So yeah, that's, it's interesting. And so community wise, I don't know. I mean, in the ways that I keep coming back to people and I don't always use the same people, but I definitely feel like there's a community of like-minded individuals that I've tapped into, that I'm comfortable with, and we enjoy working together. And I guess the podcast in its own way has developed some sort of thing too.
Yeah. Well, I know our conversation has gone all over the map today, which I kind of love, actually. But do you think there's anything else that's really important for up and coming artists to know that we just haven't touched on today?
Well, I think some of it ties back to what I was saying about how things have changed, is that at the end of the day, like, we're talking about music here for the most part, or at least everything sort of stems from that. And as I was saying, like the whole thing of playing live gigs was really the way that I learned how to do what I do. And from that, it's like everything that I do now is sort of an offshoot of that in one way or another. And I still think that's important. I just think young people have to figure out probably some new ways of pulling that off. But like, in my mind, there's no shortcut through the cutting your teeth part of like being out there doing gigs. And like, it's so important to have that experience, get out of your bedroom and like play some shows. And that means different things to different people. But, and I know the opportunities aren't the same as what they were, but to me, that's like still such an important part of developing as a musician into whatever it may be. If you want to be an engineer or a producer or a musician or a teacher or whatever, I still think that that's kind of a key element that I think people are aware of the importance of it, but it seems to get downplayed a little bit. And I guess that's what I would say is like still the most important thing is like spending that time ideally in a situation where there's some performance involved. And it's not just about like the audience or the crowd. It's like about learning how to communicate and work out arrangements with people and figure out how music works. There's no other way of doing it than just diving in there and getting it done.
So where can people find you, Steve? All the socials and the web and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Instagram, Facebook. I think the Instagram thing is easy. I think it's just Steve Dawson Music. Facebook is something Steve Dawson-ish. Not sure.
I'll look it up. I'll put it in the show
notes.
notes.
My website is stevedawson.ca, and that has links to all that stuff. I'm pretty active on YouTube as well. I haven't been for a couple months, but that's something that I do a fair amount of. So I have a channel there. I think it's Steve Dawson Music. Again, that all those links are on my website. And I'm not active at all on Twitter, but I do have a Twitter handle. I think it's Nailbiter16, but Twitter to me hasn't really like been much of a thing for me. So I don't really do that. But my Instagram is pretty engaged, and Facebook sort of, it's been less lately, but I'm fairly active on there, but YouTube tends to be the thing where I'm doing more stuff these days.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome.
Long and winding road.
Thanks for asking me, and nice to talk to you again after a long time.
After a long time of not going to school together.
Almost. I vicariously went to CAP through all my friends.